everybody, and welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for being here. Today's video is another soft-spoken true crime video. This is actually part 2 of the Christie Marceau case. So if you haven't seen part 1, I highly suggest doing that before watching this video, but I will give you a quick rundown of what happened in part 1. So this case occurred in 2011 in New Zealand, specifically in Auckland, which is in the North Island. Christie Marceau, who was a beautiful 18-year-old girl who was studying at university and working part-time, was kidnapped and then murdered by Akshay Chand. In part 1 of the video, we went over the kidnapping of Christie Marceau by Akshay Chand, who was a boy that she had met at her part-time job at a Countdown supermarket. And Christie, being the bubbly, compassionate, kind person she was, sort of took Akshay in at first and allowed him to talk to her about his struggles, but he soon grew very obsessive over Christie. And it got to the point where Christie and her family were growing somewhat concerned. However, because they were going to be moving to Australia, they felt secure that soon their troubles with Akshay would be over. However, one day Christie woke up to a phone call from Akshay, and he rang her and said that he was going to commit suicide. So she rushed over to his house, which was just a few minutes away, and when she got there, he actually held her captive. So this was Christie's kidnapping, in which she had to go through the ordeal of being held at knife point and being threatened with physical violence and with rape. Akshay told Christie that he wanted to get revenge on her because he claimed that she hadn't been there for him during his depression, when in reality Christie had been her kind, compassionate self, and Akshay had just grown very toxic and obsessive with her. For whatever reason, on the day that he kidnapped Christie, he didn't end up going through with his so-called revenge. But nevertheless, this attack obviously severely affected Christie, and she was terrified. She was dealing with post-traumatic stress, and she started going to therapy for this, but was still really struggling with the effects of such an attack. So Akshay was actually arrested after Christie went to the police about the attack, and the police were very invested in making sure that Akshay was put away for this attack and not released on bail. So Christie herself actually wrote a letter detailing why she didn't want Akshay to be released on bail, and the police made an argument as well. But ultimately, at his second bail hearing, Judge McNaughton allowed Akshay to be released. So where we left off in part 1 was that Tracy, Christie's mother, had just found out the horrible, terrifying news that Akshay had been released on bail, and despite the fact that he was released under several conditions, such as that he had to be supervised at all times and live at his mother's house and only go out for mental psychiatric appointments, she knew that this wasn't going to be enough. She was terrified, and Christie was devastated, which we'll get into now. So that pretty much brings us up to speed, so let's get into the video. But before we do, if you do like these types of videos, please remember to like and subscribe, and comment below what videos you'd like to see in future, or what cases you'd like to see. When Tracy told Christie the horrifying news that her attacker, Akshay, was being released, Christie was clearly distraught and afraid, but she tried to put on a brave face for her family. Tracy said, quote, "I truly admire her courage and unconditional love for us in doing that. I don't think any mother could ever ask for what Christie gave so selflessly." But Brian and Tracy were still terrified for Christie's safety and were taking every possible precaution to protect her, driving her everywhere she went and waiting outside in the driveway when she would be dropped off or picked up by friends. Ryan seriously considered leaving his job in Australia so that he could stay at home permanently, but he was convinced by the police that this wasn't necessary, and given that he had only been at the job for 5 months and they needed the income, he went back to work with a heavy heart. The police were also extremely concerned for Christie's safety. Detective Sergeant James Watson, who was in charge of the kidnapping file, said, quote, "Anybody that is facing serious charges like that is put on the radar." Police would do random checks on Akshay at his house from the moment that he was bailed, sometimes twice a day. The detective said, quote, "We did that because it was important to show him that he could be checked whenever, wherever, and as many times as we needed to check on him." Every time that detectives checked on Akshay, he was at home and would always come to the door and greet police courteously. Akshay's mother, Suchita, was also taking precautions and would later tell police, quote, "Whenever I left the house, I would put all the knives in a compartment under the oven. There is a panel that comes off, but to look at it, you wouldn't know." Suchita said that when she left the house, she would hide the knives, and on coming back, she would bring them back out, saying, quote, "At no time did Akshay ask where the knives were, and I have no idea if he realized I was hiding them." Akshay's younger sister also said that she was hiding any knives she could find in the house, even small ones, because she was afraid of her brother, and said that her mother was as well. Quote, "We did this because we were both scared about what he might do. I took every opportunity to stay at friends' houses so I didn't have to be at home." And just going off script for a moment, I think that's really telling that Akshay's own mother and sister were clearly very terrified of him. Just another sign that he should not have been let out on bail. But despite the precautions of Akshay's family, the police, and Christie's parents, it wasn't enough. It seemed that everyone around him knew that he should never have been released on bail and feared for what would happen if he was, only to have their fears realized on November 7th, 2011, 32 days after he was granted bail. At 6:30 a.m. that Monday morning, Christie Marceau was fast asleep in her bed, enjoying a sleep-in because she wouldn't have to work that day until 11 a.m. And just a reminder, at this point Christie was working at a local cheese shop with her older sister Heather. That same morning, Akshay Chand was waking up early to execute his second attack on Christie, intending to fulfill his desire for revenge. He was due to appear in court just 2 days later and knew that he wished to go ahead with his plans beforehand, but had given it time so that police, Christie, and his own family would let their guard down. His mother had stopped hiding the knives in the days beforehand, but this didn't matter regardless, because Akshay had known of her secret hiding place, and one of the knives was already in his carry bag, where he had placed it while he bided his time and waited for what he thought to be the perfect day to use it against Christie Marceau. Alongside the knife in the bag was a hammer, which he planned to use if he had any problems getting into Christie's home, but he wouldn't end up needing to use it. Akshay grabbed the bag and left the house with his headphones in, deciding to listen to Radiohead's Up on the Ladder, which he had put on loop. He would later tell psychiatrists that he felt as though the song had been written for him. The walk to Christie's house via a shortcut through the reserve was only about 350 meters, and he arrived at approximately 6:30 a.m. that morning. He walked up the Marceau's driveway to the front door and rang the doorbell. Inside the house, Christie's mother Tracy was still in her dressing gown, getting ready for work, and Christie's grandmother Shirley was downstairs in her granny flat, which was on the ground floor. Tracy had had breakfast and let the dogs outside, and she was just about to go and get dressed when she heard the doorbell ring. She described this moment, saying, quote, "I had just had a shower but was still in my dressing gown. It It wasn't unusual for a courier to be at our door at this time. But of course, it wasn't a courier at the door this time. It was Akshay, who stood in the doorway with a knife, giving Tracy only a moment to recognize him before he pushed his way in, forcing himself into their home. What happened next is best described through Tracy's recollection. He knew the layout of our house and forced me into the hallway towards the bedrooms. I couldn't get my hands on anything to use to protect myself or my baby girl. I remember screaming, hoping that our neighbours would hear, and I also prayed that Christie would hear and get away. He kept flashing the knife at me and asking who was in the house, so I desperately tried to warn him off by telling him Brian was home. It wasn't true, and he knew this, so now I feel that he had been watching our movements. I don't think I can describe absolute terror. It's something you don't comprehend until you experience it. The hardest thing is realizing how Christie would have felt before he killed her. Mothers protect their children, but I never got that chance. Christie was asleep in her room and my screams woke her, but she hadn't heard me screaming his name as a warning to her, and she came up the stairs. When she saw him, she started screaming too. She was saying, oh my God," and was in total shock and couldn't move. He held me off, pointing the knife at me, and kicked her hard in the chest. Christie tumbled down the stairs, but managed to get up and run through my mum's flat. He quickly took off after her, and then blind panic hit me. I knew I couldn't overpower him, so I got to the phone and called 111. Stupidly, I thought that it would be like the kidnapping. He would just frighten her and the police would get her in time. Judge David McNaughton had let this guy out because he didn't deem him a risk to Christie or the community, so I truly believed I could get the police there quickly enough to help her. I kept telling the operator, please send police, there's a guy got into our house and he's after my daughter. I only got our address out to the operator before I heard Christie scream, and that is the last sound I ever heard from my beautiful daughter. I dropped the phone and ran to the outside of the house. Even then, I still thought that she would be okay. I ran to the garden and saw Christie lying on the deck. He was still standing in our garden, but I didn't care. I ran to Christie because that was all that I was concerned about. I cradled her in my arms and just kept telling her to hang on and that I loved her so much. I couldn't see any marks or injuries on her front, and I couldn't understand why she wasn't moving. I only found out afterwards that the coward had stabbed her in the back. So during the time in which Christie had run outside, chased by Akshay, and Tracy had frantically called the police, Akshay had managed to stab Christie in the back of the head, and she fell to the deck, unable to defend herself. Akshay then stabbed Christie with the knife 10 to 15 times in the back, stabbing her over and over again in a frenzied attack, so violently that the knife had bent and become unusable. When he realized this, he just calmly stepped aside and watched as Tracy ran out to her daughter, cradling her in her arms until she passed away. Akshay then continued to calmly, callously watch Tracy and Christie, even when the police siren started just seconds later. Christie's grandmother, Shirley, had also come out and seen what had happened to Christie by this point. She had been awoken by the screams of her daughter and granddaughter and hurriedly got up out of bed, only to see Christie running from Akshay. Shirley described what she saw. Quote, I saw Christie running down the last of the stairs, and she slipped and fell on the last few. She slipped and fell backwards, almost right onto her back, and then got up and ran. There was a male running right after her. He had a knife in his hand and was only maybe a few steps behind her. Christie wasn't making any noise, and neither was he. I heard another scream come from Christie. This didn't last long, and then it stopped. Shirley had also frantically tried to call the police from her phone, but the battery had gone flat, and at this point she looked outside and saw Christie lying on the deck and Tracy rushing to her daughter in an attempt to save her. Quote, Christie was lying in the fetal position. There was a lot of blood around her on the deck. I didn't see her move or hear anything from her. I went outside. I could see Chant standing off to the left. He still had the knife in his hands. When I asked him something to the effect of, "What do you think you're doing? She hasn't done anything to you," he replied along the lines of, "You just don't know." Shirley then checked Christie's wrist for a pulse, but felt nothing, and later said, quote, "As far as I saw, she was lifeless. He had a sickly grin, a smirk on his face. He just stood there." A paramedic named Murray Anderson arrived just minutes after Christie was killed, but he knew that he could do nothing to help Christie, saying, quote, "I initially observed that the victim's eyes were fixed and glazed, which is one of the initial symptoms of death. There was no heart activity. Once I established that life was extinct, I returned to the ambulance." The police arrived as Murray was going back to the ambulance, and they were the ones who told Tracy that the ambulance was not required. Tracy was hysterical and angry, desperately hoping that her baby could be saved, even though she knew that she was gone. The police then attempted to bring Tracy inside, to which she was at first resistant, but she knew that she had to ring her husband Brian and let him know what had happened as soon as possible. Brian was working in South Australia, and due to the 2.5-hour time difference, he was still in bed when she called. Tracy described the call, saying, quote, "I could only sob down the line and say, 'She's gone, she's gone.' Brian was still half asleep and took a while to register what I was saying. He was in total bewilderment and shock when he realized what had happened." Tracy said that once Brian realized what had happened, she could literally feel his heart snap in that moment, and he immediately told her that he was on the way home. Tracy then called Christie's older sister, Heather, who was meant to be working with Christie that day. When Heather heard the news, she too was absolutely hysterical. After making these calls, Tracy was curled up in a ball on the hallway floor, and Detective Sergeant James Watson approached her gently to take her to the next-door neighbors. Tracy at first refused, insisting that she had to stay at home with her baby, but the detective promised her that they would look after Christie and have someone with her at all times, so Tracy and Shirley were taken next door. The neighbors had of course heard the screams and were able to look outside their windows and realize the gravity of the situation. They were told by police to pull all of their blinds as their windows looked onto where Christie's body still lay on the deck. Heather and her fiancé, Luke, arrived at the neighbor's house soon afterwards, and for a moment all they did was sob in each other's arms. But the police wanted to get the family further away from the house, away from the horrific crime scene and the media, who had started to show up around the neighborhood as news of the murder got out. Luke offered to take the family back to his parents' house, which would be a safe haven for them, but Tracy was struggling deeply at this point with survivor's guilt and a deep desire to be reunited with her baby girl. She described for a split second considering taking her own life in order to do this. Quote, "As we got to Heather's car, a vehicle came down our road, and I made the split-second decision to throw myself in front of it. I knew in the moment it would be a selfish action, but my pain would be over and I would be with Christie. I didn't get the chance, though, because at that very moment, Luke moved me into Heather's car. My pain would continue, but now I believe that was Christie telling me I would be her voice." Brian arrived in New Zealand within 12 hours of hearing of Christie's death, and in the meantime the Marceau family stayed at Luke's parents' house. Unfortunately, news of Christie's murder got out to the public and to the media before Tracy even had the chance to tell all of their close friends and family, which she said was devastating. Back at their family home, police were processing the crime scene and dealing with Akshay Chand. Detective Sergeant James Watson described the moment he arrived at Christie's house and witnessed the tragic scene for himself. He was off duty on the day, but on hearing the call that there was a stabbing, he decided to assist the detectives going to the address. At first, he didn't realize that the victim was Christie, or that the perpetrator was Akshay, the boy who he had fought to not be released on bail. He would later recall the moment when he realized what had happened to Christie. Quote, "After the first call and en route to the address, it didn't click to me that it was Christie. It wasn't until I drove up her street and saw the police cars outside the address that I realized it was the Marceau house, and that's probably when my heart just sank. I went down the driveway to where Christie was, and that's when I saw that she had been killed. It was a shocking thing. I've been to a few homicide scenes, and very rarely do you get to know a victim to any degree prior to them being killed. Obviously, on this occasion, we'd met. We'd caught the person responsible for the kidnapping, and we'd tried to do as much as we could to protect her. And then here we find her covered in blood, deceased at the back of her house. When I first saw her, I was in disbelief, really. I had to go and check that it was Christie." So, when Detective Sergeant James Watson had arrived, Akshay had already been taken into a police car at this point. And he went up to the car and looked inside, and he saw that it was Akshay. And he said that his heart just sank. 2 days after Christie's murder, Tracy had relayed to police the horror of her death in as much detail as she could recall. She said that after realizing Christie was dead, she let out a horrible, animalistic scream, but Akshay was still standing nearby and grinning. Tracy said, quote, "The look on his face when he was standing there was just so intent. He knew what he was doing, and he knew what he'd done. There was no remorse on his face whatsoever." When the police arrived and Christie's family had been taken away from the scene, Akshay Chand was taken away for an interview. On the drive to the police station, Akshay was acting eerily calm and nonchalant, as if he hadn't just committed a horrific murder. He casually asked the officer driving him to the station what music he listened to and what political party he voted for, all while being covered in Christie's blood. It was a few hours before Akshay would be interviewed. He was first given a medical examination at the police station, then read his Bill of Rights before speaking to a lawyer. But police had no problem whatsoever getting a confession out of him. Akshay wanted to give the police a statement. He was interviewed by Detective Darren Atwood, and Akshay freely admitted to him that he had murdered Christie, that it was premeditated, and that he had zero remorse. He also recounted the entirety of the murder, starting from the moment he had woken up to the moment he had been taken away. One thing that Akshay also said in the interview was that he had a female accomplice who hadn't been caught, and who was still out there and going to continue killing. During the interview, his behavior was eerie and bizarre. He asked Detective Atwood if he was going to be on television, and when he was left alone, he started posing for the camera that was in the interview room. Detective Sergeant Watson had been supervising the interview and said, quote, "I didn't see any remorse. I didn't see any emotion, and it was quite a difficult thing for an officer to sit there and listen to it." Before Detective Sergeant Watson had arrived to supervise Akshay's interview, he had stayed at the crime scene, immediately ordering for a gazebo tent to be placed at the scene in order to cover Christie out of respect and to shield her from the eyes of neighbours, the public, and the media. He then called out experts to process the crime scene and look for DNA, fingerprints, and blood spatter, as well as crime scene photographers to photograph the scene before Christie's body was taken away. Her body underwent an autopsy in the days following, which is when it was discovered how many times she had been stabbed, but also that the first stab to her head had incapacitated her to the point that she would not have felt the pain of the attack from that point onwards, which was a small consolation. The day that Akshay Chand was arrested, he was put in front of a judge, this time on the charge of murder, and the police quickly filed another bail opposition document. Detective Sergeant Watson had also supervised Christie's autopsy in order to gather all the facts of the murder and begin to put together his case against Akshay Chand. After gathering all the evidence, he believed it would be a fairly open and shut court case, particularly due to the killer's confession and the witnesses to the murder. But what he didn't see coming was that Akshay Chand was pleading not guilty by reason of insanity, which was a plea that the prosecution accepted due to their psychiatrist concluding that Akshay was mentally ill at the time of the murder. Detective Sergeant Watson said, quote, "I wouldn't say it's played out how I wanted it to, but there are some things you can't control." Chand was found insane, and that's something for a psychiatrist and the court to decide. He did agree that he thought Akshay Chand was mentally ill. However, he said, "I am 100% convinced that he is one of the most dangerous people I have ever come across. Very rarely do you encounter someone who has caused so much pain to someone, but then is so calm and collected and shows no remorse. To me, this is a sign of a person who is dangerous. He is intelligent, he can plan, and he seems to know the system." Christie's family were also devastated by the news that the prosecution were not contesting to the insanity plea. They had been working with the prosecution, who had given them the news in person, and Tracy was horrified. She said, quote, "I cried, I screamed, and I just wanted them to say they were joking." The prosecution psychiatrist, Dr. Graham Malsop, agreed to meet with the Marceau family to explain how he reached his conclusion that Akshay was mentally ill at the time of Christie's murder. Tracy said that she anticipated hating Dr. Graham Malsop, but as he explained his decision, they began to understand it. She said, quote, "The insanity decision had been made because it was crucial that Chand was treated and detained to make sure no one else was ever at risk." She also said, quote, "It wasn't about us giving up or falling for his latest ploy to get out of jail. It was about making sure he was kept away from innocent people for as long as possible." On September 27, 2012, Akshay Chand appeared in front of the High Court in Auckland, not for the murder charges, but the initial kidnapping charges. He pled guilty to all three charges, despite initially planning to plead not guilty, just as he would be for the murder charges. It was the first time Christie's family had seen Akshay Chand since the day of Christie's murder, and Tracy said, quote, "I thought I would be angry, but I felt nothing. I think it was because I didn't see him as human. He meant nothing to me. I was there to focus on the small piece of justice we were being offered for Christie." Unfortunately, Christie did not receive the justice that the Marceau family were hoping for, and for the kidnapping charges, Akshay was sentenced to only 3 years. Tracy said, quote, "We knew not to expect more, but when we actually heard it read out, we felt so angry that our beautiful Christie was worth no more than 3 years. Of course we felt he should have gotten a longer sentence, because the first charges were what led to him to killing Christie, and we knew that he was going to be found not guilty by reason of insanity for her murder, so we felt ripped off in a way. We wouldn't be parents if we thought otherwise." 1 month later, Akshay appeared at the Auckland High Court for the murder of Christie Marceau, and Christie's family were present once again, bracing themselves for what they knew would be an incredible, difficult time. Up until that point, they had not heard the details of Akshay's confession, which Tracy said was, quote, "abhorrent and sickening to us." She also said, quote, "I thought my heart had already been shattered, but there must have been fragments left, because sitting and listening to what he said about Christie after he killed her, the heartache was indescribable." But Tracy knew that she needed to be strong for Christie and to, quote, "let her killer know that as a family we were a united force and that Christie still had our love and support." Akshay's own family was present at the trial, and this in itself was sickening to Christie's family, who had no contact with him whatsoever, other than an impersonal sympathy card that Akshay's mother Suchita had sent after her son had murdered Christie. Tracy said, quote, "We did not speak, and I have nothing to say to her. She must now live every day knowing that she could have done more to prevent what happened, because she admitted that she had seen a decline in him. She lives with the knowledge that he did not have adequate support or care for his mental health problems, and I think this is punishment enough. During his trial, Akshay claimed to have been mentally influenced by an 8-year-old British girl named Pauline, who he claimed to hear the voice of in his head. Pauline had apparently told Akshay to kill Christie because Christie was the devil, but he kept Pauline a secret despite his claims that he had been hearing her since January 2011. This played into the insanity defense that Akshay's lawyers were presenting, as did Akshay's claims to not remember the actual murder. When Akshay's lawyer, Marianne Lowe, started exploring the possibility of an insanity defense, she hired Dr. David Chaplow, who was the National Director of Mental Health for the Ministry of Health and one of New Zealand's leading forensic psychiatrists. Chaplow was brought on to assess Akshay and did so once in March of 2020 and once in April of 2012. According to Dr. Chaplow, he had seen a huge change in Akshay between those 2 visits due to Akshay starting to take an antipsychotic medication between the 2 assessments. Akshay told Dr. Chaplow that Pauline, who he had first said was named Lorelei, was the one who had murdered Christie because she had an enormous amount of control over him. He said that he knew that killing Christie was wrong and that he struggled against Pauline for as long as he could, but on the morning he killed Christie, he could no longer resist her. However, after starting antipsychotic medication, Akshay said he was feeling much better and no longer heard any voices. Also, Akshay dropped the whole female accomplice thing, whether or not he was meaning Pauline or there was just no one ever, which is the more likely scenario. He let that go pretty quick. Dr. Chaplow also witnessed a change in Akshay in regards to remorse, of which he claimed Akshay had none in his first interview, but in the second felt intensely. Dr. Chaplow ultimately told the court that Akshay Chand was not mentally ill when he kidnapped Christie, but that he was when he murdered her, saying, quote, "It is likely that he has a schizophrenic-like illness. Very few persons with such illnesses kill others. However, some with an undeclared and untreated illness may follow command hallucinations insightlessly and injure others." Dr. Chaplow's opinion was backed up by the prosecution psychiatrist Graham Malsop, who specialised in psychiatric disorders. He was given Dr. Chaplow's report, interview footage, and all the case notes and court paperwork, and also interviewed Akshay himself in July of 2012. And not only did Professor Malsop agree with Dr. Chaplow, but he said that Akshay had believed himself to be haunted by Lucifer, who had first possessed his father and then possessed Christie, which is why Pauline had commanded him to kill her. He also claimed that this was why Akshay hadn't initially told anyone about Pauline, because he knew that if he did, they would stop him from fulfilling her command to take out the devil. Yeah, not at all, because Pauline wasn't real and Akshay was just making this up. Of course not. Can you tell I'm struggling with this? Professor Malsop also concluded that Akshay Chand presented qualities that were characteristic of schizophrenia. He said, quote, "In my opinion, that disorder is still present to a significant degree. The evidence available suggests to me that his disorder was so significant and pervasive, and some of the psychotic phenomena so specific to his actions on November 7th, that in fact he did not know at the time what he was doing was morally wrong. His apparent overwhelming indifference to the perspectives, feelings, and interests of Christie are consistent with that. It is my view that at the time of the crime, Chand knew the nature and quality of his acts. The degree and severity of his disease of the mind meant that he did not know what he was doing was morally wrong when he stabbed and killed Christie. I agree with the opinion of Dr. Chaplow that on November 7th, on the balance of probabilities, Chand met that criteria for legal insanity." Professor Malsop did, however, make it clear that, even if found insane by the court, Akshay Chand should be locked up indefinitely because he still posed a risk to the community and to Christie's family. After hearing from two mental health professionals on both the defense and prosecution sides that Akshay Chand could not be held legally responsible for the murder of Christie Marceau due to his mental health issues at the time of the murder, the judge, Justice Winkleman, found Akshay not guilty by reason of insanity. She then made an order to make Akshay Chand a special patient to be detained indefinitely in a secure mental health facility until the Ministry of Health was satisfied that he was no longer a risk to the safety of the public. On October 17, 2012, Akshay Chand was taken to Mason Clinic, a secure mental health clinic located just outside of Auckland's central city. At the clinic, there are units for forensic mental health inpatients where people like Akshay are treated. His progress must be reviewed every 6 months by a special patient review panel which reports back to the Ministry of Health, who decide whether Akshay is to be released. At this clinic, Akshay has his own bedroom but shares communal spaces such as the kitchen, bathrooms and lounges. He's allowed approved visitors such as family and can even go on little field trips with the clinic, which is how the Marceau family ended up seeing him in public one day. Which I can't even imagine how horrific that is. It should not be a thing, it should not be allowed, but this is the world that we live in. It's completely ridiculous and unfair. But despite this, and despite all of the horrible things that they had to go through, the Marceau family has tried their best to find the light in the situation and honour Christie's memory. Christie's funeral was a beautiful celebration of her life. Tracy said, quote, "We managed to get a lovely turquoise casket and we all wrote messages over it for her. It was very personal and written with love from the heart. Hundreds of people turned up to farewell her, some we didn't even know. There were so many that they spilled out into the car park of the chapel." Just weeks after Christie died, her family started a group called Christie's Law in her honour, campaigning for bail reform and judicial accountability in New Zealand, both of which were huge factors in Christie's murder. Under Christie's Law, they campaigned for judges who make a wrong decision that ends up costing a life or further harm to the community to be held responsible, for police to have the power to veto a judge's decision to grant bail, a regular review system of judges to be introduced, and other reforms regarding bail, judges and court processes. They knew that any changes made because of this would be too late to save Christie, but they hoped that they might prevent something like Christie's murder from happening again. Tracy said in her book, quote, "While Christie is the face of Christie's Law, she also represents the many taken so unjustly before her. The campaign is something Brian and I chose to commit to through love for our child, and because we never want any other family to go through our nightmare, which was so preventable and needless." Christie's sister, Heather, was also involved in Christie's Law and said, quote, "I just want the bail laws to be changed. I know that nothing will bring my sister back to me, but because of the way they are, I had to walk down the aisle without my sister in front of me. Now I have to face every day without her." As well as Christie's Law, Tracy and Brian also started the Christie Marceau Charitable Trust, which was launched on November 11th, 2012. The trust was not only in honour of Christie, but to continue on her legacy of helping people. Tracy said, quote, "Christie did not judge people and would help anyone, and we intend to honour that principle and enable as many people as possible to have access to grants from the trust. This will make it possible for people to live their dreams, something Christie can never do, and something that they may not be able to do themselves without her help. I know she is helping us and will lead us along the right path." Tracy and Brian also decided to go ahead with moving to Australia and settled in Adelaide like they had planned to with Christie. It was too painful to stay in New Zealand, where there were now so many painful memories, and they wanted a fresh start in Australia and knew that Christie would want them to as well. They boarded the plane with Christie's urn safely by their side, which now sits safely next to her favourite soft toy, Basil the dog, who Tracy says is still watching over her and protecting her even now. Tracy detailed in her book that moving to Australia didn't make dealing with the trauma of Christie's death any easier, and she still dealt with fear and guilt daily, but slowly started to go out and do things, encouraging herself by saying Christie would like that. Tracy said, quote, "I still talk to her every day and I know she is with me. She often visits me in my dreams to comfort me, and these are the days I awaken happier. And with that, we are at the end of today's video. Thank you so much for sticking around and hearing Christie's story. I know that it was a very upsetting and at times incredibly frustrating case to listen to, but I think it is so important to tell this one, not only because we want to remember Christie for the beautiful girl that she was, but also because it's important to hold those people accountable, particularly Judge David McNaughton. I would love to hear what you guys think of this case. Do you believe that the judge who released Akshay on bail is partially to blame for Christie's death? Obviously, the blame for her murder does lie with Akshay, but what do you think in terms of accountability, and do you think there should be more action taken to help to hold people like Judge David McNaughton accountable? Also, I'd love to know what you think of Pauline, whether you think Akshay was entirely making all of that up. Do you think he really was being spoken to by some kind of so-called demon? Was he possessed by Satan? Do you think Pauline exists? I tried to keep my thoughts out of it for the most part, but I'm sure you can pick up what my thoughts are on that. I think he was just a very sick and twisted person. No doubt he was mentally ill, but that is absolutely no excuse, and I think a lot of what he said was just so that he could be found not guilty by reason of insanity. So I'd love to hear what you guys think, but to really close off this video, I just want to end with this beautiful quote that Tracy wrote in her book about Christie, so that we can really remember Christie for the right reasons. Christie's friends will remember that she was fun, supportive, and outgoing. Her family will remember that she was a daughter, sister, granddaughter, and the best person to put you in the Christmas spirit. And I will remember that she was my baby, who I love so much. She deserves to be remembered for who she was, not what Chand did to her. Thank you guys again so much for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed this video and that I will see you in my next one.